The night train carved through the darkness like a silver ribbon, its rhythmic clatter against the rails creating a lullaby that should have been comforting. But for 8-year-old Thomas, hunched in seat 12B with nothing but a worn backpack and clothes that hadn't been washed in days, comfort felt like a luxury he'd forgotten existed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. His small frame pressed against the cold window as city lights blurred past in streaks of gold and amber. The conductor had already checked his ticket twice, eyeing the unaccompanied minor tag pinned to his jacket with poorly concealed concern. Thomas had learned to avoid those looks, the ones that asked questions he wasn't ready to answer. The train car was nearly empty at this late hour, save for a handful of passengers scattered across the worn velvet seats. Most were business people heading home from late meetings, their faces buried in laptops or phones. None paid attention to the small boy whose world had crumbled just 3 days ago. Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his stomach growling despite his efforts to ignore it. The last proper meal he'd eaten was the hospital cafeteria sandwich a nurse had bought him before delivering the news that would change everything. His grandmother, the only family he had left after his parents died in a car accident 2 years earlier, was gone. Heart attack, they said. Peaceful, they said. But there was nothing peaceful about being 8 years old and completely alone in the world. The social worker had been kind but overwhelmed, explaining that temporary foster care would be arranged, that everything would work out somehow. But Thomas had heard the hushed conversations, the phone calls about limited space and waiting lists. He'd seen enough movies to know what happened to kids like him. So when the nurse stepped away for just a moment, he'd slipped out of the hospital and used the last of his grandmother's emergency money to buy a train ticket to the only place that felt like home anymore, the small coastal town where he'd spent summers with her before she moved closer to the city. The train swayed gently as it rounded a curve, and Thomas's eyelids grew heavy, despite his determination to stay alert. He'd been awake for nearly 48 hours, surviving on adrenaline and fear. But exhaustion was winning the battle, and his head began to nod forward. That's when the passenger in seat 12A shifted, and Thomas became aware he was no longer alone in his row. The man who'd settled beside him was probably in his 50s, with silver threading through his dark hair and kind eyes that seemed to hold stories of their own. He wore a simple gray sweater and carried only a small leather messenger bag, suggesting this journey wasn't about business. The stranger had noticed Thomas the moment he'd boarded 3 stops back, not with the sharp scrutiny of someone looking for trouble, but with the gentle awareness of someone who recognized pain when he saw it. He'd deliberately chosen the seat beside the boy, though he'd kept a respectful distance and hadn't attempted conversation. As Thomas's head drooped further toward sleep, the man quietly removed his own jacket and, moving with the careful precision of someone who understood the fragility of trust, draped it gently over the boy's shoulders. The gesture was so subtle that other passengers wouldn't have noticed, but Thomas felt the warmth immediately. His eyes fluttered open briefly, meeting the stranger's gaze with a mixture of wariness and gratitude. The man offered the smallest of smiles, one that somehow conveyed both understanding and safety without demanding anything in return. "It's okay," the stranger whispered, his voice barely audible above the train's rhythm. "Rest now. I'll make sure you're safe." Something in those words, or perhaps the genuine kindness behind them, allowed Thomas to finally surrender to sleep. His small body relaxed against the seat, the stranger's jacket providing not just physical warmth, but the first sense of security he'd felt in days. The man watched over him with the vigilance of a guardian, noting how the boy's sleep was fitful, interrupted by small whimpers and the occasional tear that escaped even in unconsciousness. During a brief stop at midnight, when the conductor made his rounds, the stranger quietly spoke with him, ensuring Thomas wouldn't be disturbed or questioned until morning. Hours passed in this peaceful vigil. The stranger never moved from his protective position, never invaded Thomas's space, but remained a constant, reassuring presence. When the boy stirred from nightmares, he would find those kind eyes still watching, still offering silent comfort. As dawn began to paint the sky in soft pastels, Thomas woke naturally for the first time in days. The jacket was still around his shoulders, and the stranger was quietly reading a worn paperback novel, giving the boy space to orient himself without pressure. "Good morning," the man said softly when he noticed Thomas was fully awake. "Did you sleep better?" Thomas nodded, surprised to realize he actually had. There was something about this stranger's presence that felt different from the parade of adults who'd surrounded him lately. No clipboard, no urgent questions, no barely concealed panic about what to do with him. "I'm David," the man offered, closing his book and giving Thomas his full attention. "What's your name?" "Thomas," came the quiet reply, followed by a pause before he added, "Thank you for the jacket." David smiled, the expression transforming his entire face. "You looked cold. Are you traveling far?" The simple question opened a floodgate Thomas hadn't expected. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or the relief of finally feeling safe, but the words came tumbling out. He told David about his grandmother, about the hospital, about having nowhere to go and no one who really wanted him. He spoke about the summers by the sea, the little cottage where his grandmother taught him to skip stones and make sandcastles. David listened without interruption, his expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. When Thomas finished, his young voice hoarse from emotion, David was quiet for a long moment. "You know," David said finally, "I'm heading to a small town called Millbrook Bay. It's right on the coast. Beautiful place, especially this time of year." Thomas's eyes widened. Millbrook Bay was exactly where he was going, though he hadn't mentioned the name to David. "I have a house there," David continued conversationally. "Nothing fancy, but it has a garden and you can see the ocean from the kitchen window. The thing is, I could really use some help with a project I'm working on. Someone young and smart who isn't afraid of a little hard work." The offer hung in the air between them, and Thomas felt his heart racing. Adults had made promises before, promises that evaporated when reality set in. But something about David felt different, solid in a way the others hadn't. "What kind of project?" Thomas asked cautiously. David's eyes lit up with genuine enthusiasm. "I'm restoring an old lighthouse that's been abandoned for years. The local historical society wants to turn it into a museum, but it needs a lot of work. Painting, cleaning, organizing old records. The kind of job that requires careful attention and someone who appreciates history." He paused, studying Thomas's face carefully. Of course, anyone who helped with a project like that would need a place to stay, meals, maybe even a small salary for their work. It could take months to complete. Thomas stared at this stranger who seemed to be offering him everything he'd lost: a home, purpose, maybe even a future. "Why would you want to help me?" David's expression grew serious, and for the first time, Thomas glimpsed the depth of sadness that lived behind the man's kind eyes. "Because a long time ago, someone helped me when I had nowhere else to turn. Sometimes that's just how kindness works, Thomas. It passes from one person to another." The train began to slow as they approached Millbrook Bay Station. Through the window, Thomas could... Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. See the familiar sights of the small coastal town waking up, fishing boats bobbing in the harbor, seagulls wheeling overhead. It looked exactly as he remembered from those precious summer visits with his grandmother. David gathered his belongings and stood, offering his hand to Thomas. "What do you say? Want to see if we can bring that old lighthouse back to life?" Thomas looked at the extended hand, then up at David's face. For the first time in days, he felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. He reached out and took David's hand, surprised by how natural the gesture felt. "I'd like that," he said quietly. As they stepped off the train together, Thomas carrying his small backpack and David's jacket still wrapped around his shoulders, neither of them could have imagined how this chance encounter would reshape both their lives. The morning sun cast long shadows on the platform, and somewhere in the distance, Thomas could hear the sound of waves against the shore. David led him to an old but well-maintained pickup truck parked outside the station. "Home's about 10 minutes from here," he said as they climbed in. "We'll get you settled, find you some proper clothes, and maybe grab some breakfast." "I'm guessing it's been a while since you had a real meal," Thomas nodded, his stomach growling audibly at the mention of food. As they drove through the winding streets of Millbrook Bay, he pressed his face to the window, drinking in the familiar sights. The town hadn't changed much since his last visit. Still the same weathered fishing boats, the same small shops with hand-painted signs, the same feeling of being somewhere time moved a little slower. They passed the street where his grandmother's old cottage had been, and Thomas felt a pang of loss, mixed with something that might have been healing. She was gone, but this place still held echoes of her love, her laughter, her endless patience with a small boy who asked too many questions. David's house sat on a small bluff overlooking the bay, a modest two-story building with cedar shingles weathered silver by years of salt air. A wraparound porch faced the water, and Thomas could see wind chimes hanging from the eaves, their gentle music audible even through the truck windows. "It's not much," David said as he parked, "but it's peaceful. And wait until you see the lighthouse." He pointed down the coast, where an old stone tower stood sentinel on a rocky promontory. Even from this distance, Thomas could see it needed work. The paint was peeling, some of the windows were boarded up, and weeds had grown up around its base. But there was something majestic about it, too. Something that spoke of stories and history, and the kind of purpose Thomas had been searching for without knowing it. Inside the house, David showed Thomas to a small bedroom on the second floor. It was simply furnished but comfortable, with a window that looked out over the garden toward the sea. Clean clothes in approximately Thomas's size had been laid out on the bed, along with fresh towels and toiletries. "How did you know?" Thomas asked, fingering the soft fabric of a new shirt. David's smile was gentle but evasive. "Lucky guess. Why don't you get cleaned up and I'll start breakfast? Do you like pancakes?" As Thomas stood under the warm spray of the shower, washing away days of fear and uncertainty, he began to wonder about his mysterious benefactor. David had seemed to know exactly what Thomas needed before Thomas himself had known. The clothes, the offer of work and purpose, even the destination, it all felt too perfect to be coincidence. But as he dressed in the clean clothes and combed his hair for the first time in days, Thomas decided that maybe some mysteries were worth living with. Whatever David's story was, whatever had brought them together on that train, it felt like the first good thing that had happened to him in a very long time. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled like vanilla and butter, and David was standing at the stove flipping pancakes with the easy confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. The table was set for two, with orange juice and fresh fruit arranged beside steaming plates. "Feel better?" David asked as Thomas appeared in the doorway. "Much better," Thomas replied, and realized he meant it. For the first time since leaving the hospital, he felt like himself again. Not a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed, but just a boy named Thomas who was hungry for breakfast and curious about what came next. As they ate, David told him more about the lighthouse project. The structure dated back to the 1800s and had guided ships safely to harbor for over a century before being decommissioned when modern navigation equipment made it obsolete. The Historical Society had purchased it from the Coast Guard, but lacked the resources for restoration. "That's where we come in," David explained. "I've been working on it in my spare time for about a year now, but it's a big job for one person. The foundation is solid, but everything else needs attention. New paint, restored windows, electrical work, organizing decades worth of old equipment and records." Thomas listened intently, already imagining himself climbing the spiral staircase to the lamp room, looking out over the endless expanse of ocean. "When can we start?" David chuckled at his enthusiasm. "How about this afternoon? But first, I thought we might take a walk around town, get you familiar with the place. There's a library, a small school, some shops. If you're going to be staying for a while, you should know your way around." The word, staying, sent a warm flutter through Thomas's chest. He'd been afraid to hope for permanence, afraid to trust that this wasn't just another temporary arrangement that would dissolve when the reality of caring for him set in. They spent the morning exploring Millbrook Bay, and Thomas was amazed by how many people seemed to know David. The librarian greeted him warmly and immediately offered to help Thomas get his own library card. The woman at the hardware store asked about his lighthouse project and insisted on giving them a discount on supplies. The elderly man who ran the bait shop stopped his conversation with other customers to shake Thomas's hand and welcome him to town. "You're pretty popular around here," Thomas observed as they walked along the harbor. David shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed. "Small town. Everyone knows everyone." But Thomas was starting to notice things, the way he'd learned to during those uncertain months after his parents died, when reading adult faces had become a survival skill. The respect people showed David wasn't just familiarity, it was gratitude. The way the librarian's eyes softened when she looked at him, the way the hardware store owner refused payment for extra supplies, the way the old fisherman's handshake lingered just a moment longer than necessary. David wasn't just known in this town, he was cherished. And slowly, Thomas began to understand that he wasn't the first lost soul this man had helped. That afternoon, they made their way to the lighthouse, following a narrow path that wound through tall grass and scattered wildflowers. Up close, the structure was even more impressive than it had appeared from the house. The stone walls were thick and solid, built to withstand decades of storms and salt spray. Despite its neglected appearance, Thomas could sense the strength underneath, the potential waiting to be revealed. David unlocked the heavy wooden door and led Thomas inside. The interior was dark and musty, filled with the accumulated dust of years, but also filled with history. Old equipment stood covered in canvas tarps, and wooden crates filled with records and artifacts lined the walls. "The lamp room is at the top," David said, gesturing toward a spiral staircase that curved up into shadows. "Want to see the view?" The climb was longer than Thomas had expected, but when they finally emerged into the circular room at the top, the payoff was spectacular. Windows on all sides offered a panoramic view of the coastline, the town spread out below like a miniature village, and the ocean stretching endlessly toward the horizon. "Wow," Thomas breathed, pressing his hands against the glass. "Pretty amazing, isn't it?" David said, his voice filled with the same wonder Thomas felt. "Think about all the ships that saw this light over the years, all the sailors who found their way home because of what happened in this room." Thomas could imagine it, the great lens rotating slowly, sending its beam across dark waters, a beacon of safety in the night. It felt like the most important job in the world. "Can we really make it work again?" he asked. David smiled and put a gentle hand on Thomas's shoulder. "We can try. It won't be easy, and it'll take time, but I have a feeling we make a pretty good team." As they descended the stairs and began to explore the various rooms and storage areas, David outlined their plan. They would start with cleaning and organizing, cataloging the historical artifacts and preparing them for eventual display. Then came the restoration work, repairing windows, stripping and repainting walls, installing new electrical systems where needed. "The goal isn't to make it functional as a lighthouse again," David explained as they examined old charts and navigation equipment. "But we want visitors to understand what life was like for the lighthouse keepers who lived here, how the equipment worked, what role this place played in the town's history." Thomas found himself genuinely excited about the project. It felt like bringing something important back to life, like being entrusted with preserving something precious. As they worked together that first afternoon, sorting through boxes of old photographs and documents, he realized he hadn't thought about his uncertain future or his losses for hours. The work was absorbing in a way that quieted the anxious voice in his head, the one that had been whispering about foster homes and social workers, and all the ways his life could still go wrong. Here, surrounded by the tangible weight of history and David's patient guidance, Thomas felt something he'd almost forgotten, the sense that he belonged somewhere. As the sun began to set, painting the lighthouse walls in shades of gold and amber, David suggested they call it a day. "We'll have plenty of time to work on this," he said, surveying their modest progress with satisfaction. "Rome wasn't built in a day, and this lighthouse won't be restored in one either." Walking back to the house in the gathering twilight, Thomas felt the comfortable exhaustion that comes from meaningful work. His hands were dusty, his clothes smudged with dirt, but he felt more accomplished than he had in months. "David," he said as they reached the front porch, "why are you doing this, really?" David paused with his hand on the door handle, looking out at the darkening bay. For a moment, Thomas thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "When I was about your age, maybe a little older, I lost my family too. House fire. I was the only one who made it out." He turned to meet Thomas's eyes, and the boy saw the echo of old pain there, softened by time but never fully healed. "I spent years in the system, bouncing from one place to another. Most people were kind enough, but they were taking care of me, not caring about me." Do you understand the difference?" Thomas nodded slowly. He understood perfectly. "Then, when I was 16, I met a man named Captain Williams. He'd been a lighthouse keeper for 30 years before retiring, and he needed help maintaining this very lighthouse. Gave me a job, a place to stay, and more importantly, a sense of purpose. He's the one who taught me that sometimes the best way to heal your own wounds is to help heal someone else's." "What happened to him?" Thomas asked. "He passed away about 5 years ago," David said softly. "Left me this house and a letter asking me to keep an eye on the lighthouse. But more than that, he left me with an understanding of how much difference one person can make in another person's life." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of shared understanding settling between them. Thomas realized that this wasn't charity or pity. It was something much more valuable. It was recognition, one survivor seeing another, and offering not just help, but true companionship. "So when you saw me on the train," Thomas began, "I saw myself 25 years ago," David finished. "Scared, alone, trying to be brave when everything felt hopeless. And I remembered how it felt when someone finally looked at me and saw potential instead of problems." That night, as Thomas lay in the comfortable bed in his temporary room, listening to the sound of waves against the shore, he felt something shift inside him. The grief for his grandmother was still there. The sadness for his parents still ached, but underneath it all was something new and fragile and precious. Hope. Not the desperate hope of a child wishing things would magically return to the way they were, but the steady hope of someone who'd glimpsed the possibility of a different kind of future. A future built not on what he'd lost, but on what he might yet find. Through the window he could see the dark silhouette of the lighthouse against the star-filled sky. Tomorrow they would return to their work, slowly bringing it back to life, restoring its purpose and beauty. And maybe, Thomas thought as sleep finally claimed him, they would restore something in themselves as well. The next morning brought sunshine and the smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen. Thomas woke naturally, without the nightmares that had plagued him for days, and realized he'd slept through the entire night for the first time since his grandmother's death. Downstairs, David was reading a newspaper and sipping coffee from a chipped mug that looked like it had been his favorite for years. He looked up as Thomas entered, and his smile was warm and genuine. "Morning, partner," he said. "Ready for day 2 of Operation Lighthouse Rescue?" Thomas grinned back, the word, partner, filling him with pride. "Absolutely. What's the plan?" And so began the most purposeful period of Thomas's young life. Each day brought new discoveries and small victories. They uncovered a collection of ship logs dating back to the 1890s, found a brass compass that still pointed true north after decades of neglect, and slowly began to see the lighthouse's potential emerge from beneath layers of dust and damage. David proved to be an excellent teacher, patient with Thomas's questions and generous with his praise for work well done. He showed Thomas how to clean delicate historical artifacts without damaging them, how to organize documents for preservation, how to repair a window sash without disturbing the original glass. More importantly, he showed Thomas that his opinions mattered, that his ideas were valuable, that his presence made a real difference in their progress. When Thomas suggested a better way to organize the photograph collection, David implemented it immediately. When the boy noticed that one of the old lens components was missing a crucial piece, David made a note to search for a replacement. It was the kind of respect Thomas had rarely experienced from adults, the sense that he was a true collaborator rather than someone being managed or supervised. It made him work harder, think more carefully, take greater pride in every task. As weeks passed, word of their project spread through the town. Visitors began stopping by to check on their progress, sometimes bringing sandwiches for lunch, or offering to help with specific tasks. Thomas met retired fishermen who had navigated by the lighthouse's beam, elderly residents who remembered the last lighthouse keeper, and young families excited about the future museum. Each interaction reinforced his growing sense of belonging. These people weren't just being polite to David's helper. They were genuinely glad to meet him, interested in his thoughts about the restoration, appreciative of his efforts. For the first time in his life, Thomas felt like he was part of something larger than himself, something that mattered to an entire community. The transformation wasn't just happening to the lighthouse. Thomas could feel himself changing too, growing stronger and more confident with each passing day. The hollow ache of loss was still there, but it was balanced now by the satisfaction of meaningful work and the security of David's steady presence. One evening, as they sat on the lighthouse's newly cleaned observation deck watching the sunset, David brought up a subject that they'd been carefully avoiding. "Thomas," he said quietly, "we need to talk about your legal situation." Thomas felt his stomach clench with familiar anxiety. He'd been dreading this conversation, knowing it had to come but hoping somehow they could avoid it forever. "I know you ran away from the hospital," David continued gently. "And I know there are people looking for you, people who are worried about your safety." "Are you going to send me back?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. David was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun sink toward the horizon. "What would you like to happen, Thomas? If you could choose your future, what would it look like?" The question surprised him. No adult had ever asked what he wanted before. They'd only told him what was going to happen to him. "I want to stay here," Thomas said simply. "I want to finish the lighthouse. I want to help you with other projects. I want to go to school here and learn about boats and navigation, and maybe become a lighthouse keeper myself someday, even if there aren't any working lighthouses left." David smiled at that last part. "You know, there are still a few working lighthouses, and they do need keepers. It's not impossible." "Really?" "Really. But first, we need to make sure you can stay here legally. That means working with social services, proving that this is a safe and stable environment for you, and going through the proper procedures for guardianship." Thomas felt panic rising in his chest. What if they say no? What if they make me go somewhere else? "Hey," David said, reaching over to squeeze his shoulder. "Look at me." Thomas met his eyes, seeing determination there alongside the familiar kindness. "I'm not going to let that happen," David said firmly. "We're going to do this the right way, but we're going to fight for what's best for you. I've already contacted a lawyer who specializes in these cases, and she thinks we have a strong position. I'm a stable adult with a clean background. You're clearly thriving here, and the community supports us." "You've already talked to a lawyer?" David nodded. "I wanted to have a plan before we discussed it. I didn't want to get your hopes up if it wasn't possible." "And she thinks it will work?" "She thinks it will work. It might take some time, and there will be interviews and home visits and paperwork, but she's confident we can make it official." Thomas felt tears prick his eyes, but for the first time in weeks they were tears of relief rather than sadness. "You really want me to stay? Permanently?" "Thomas," David said, his voice thick with emotion, "these past few weeks have been some of the best of my life. You've brought something to this house, to this project, to this whole town that's been missing. Of course I want you to stay permanently." As the last light faded from the sky and the lighthouse stood silhouetted against the stars, Thomas realized that his journey was far from over, but for the first time, he was looking forward to what came next rather than dreading it. The train ride that had started in desperation and fear had led him to something he'd never dared to hope for: a real home, meaningful work, and an adult who saw him not as a burden or a problem, but as a partner and, maybe someday, a son. And somewhere in the distance he could hear the gentle sound of waves against the shore, a rhythm as steady and reliable as the man sitting beside him, both promising that no matter what storms might come, he would never have to face them alone again. The weeks that followed brought a parade of visitors that neither Thomas nor David had expected. Word of their lighthouse restoration had spread beyond Millbrook Bay, reaching historical societies, maritime museums, and preservation groups throughout the region. Each day seemed to bring new faces, new stories, and new offers of help. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison arrived on a Tuesday morning, her car packed with boxes of archival materials from the Maritime Heritage Foundation. She was a small woman with silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, but her eyes sparkled with the enthusiasm of someone who had devoted her life to preserving history. "I understand you're working on the Millbrook Bay Light," she said as David led her up the path to the lighthouse. "I've brought some materials I think you'll find interesting." Thomas watched from the doorway as she opened her first box, revealing photographs he'd never seen before. Images of the lighthouse during its operational years, showing the massive lens in action, the keeper's quarters furnished and lived in, ships safely guided to harbor by its beam. "This is incredible," Thomas breathed, carefully examining a photograph of lighthouse keepers from 1924. "They look so proud." "They were," Dr. Morrison said, smiling at his enthusiasm. "Lighthouse keeping was dangerous, demanding work, but it was also deeply meaningful. These men and women knew that their vigilance meant the difference between life and death for countless sailors." She spent the entire day with them, sharing stories and expertise, but more importantly, treating Thomas like a fellow historian rather than just a child helper. She asked his opinions about display arrangements, listened carefully to his questions, and even suggested he might want to write some of the educational materials for younger visitors. "You have a gift for this," she told him as she packed up to leave. "I hope you'll consider studying maritime history when you're older. We need young people who understand the importance of preserving these stories." As her car disappeared down the coastal road, Thomas felt a flutter of excitement about possibilities he'd never considered. Maybe his future could involve more than just this one lighthouse. Maybe he could help preserve maritime history all along the coast, maybe even around the world. The legal proceedings David had warned him about began the following week, but they proved far less frightening than Thomas had feared. The social worker assigned to his case was a kind woman named Mrs. Chen, who seemed genuinely interested in his well-being rather than just checking boxes on forms. Her first visit to the lighthouse clearly impressed her. She watched Thomas explain the restoration process with obvious expertise and passion, noted the careful way David guided without controlling, observed the easy interaction between them that spoke of genuine affection rather than mere obligation. "How do you feel about the possibility of staying here permanently?" she asked Thomas during their private interview. "This is the first place that's felt like home since my grandmother died," Thomas answered honestly. "David doesn't just take care of me. He believes in me. He makes me feel like I matter, like what I think and do is important." Mrs. Chen nodded thoughtfully. "And David? How do you see him?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "He's not trying to replace my parents or my grandmother. He's something different. Like a mentor, but also like family. He sees who I really am, not just a kid who needs help." The interviews continued over several weeks, but each one seemed to strengthen their case. The community support was overwhelming. Letters poured in from townspeople, visitors to the lighthouse, even from Dr. Morrison and other professionals who had met Thomas during his work on the project. Meanwhile, the lighthouse itself was transformed almost beyond recognition. The spiral staircase had been carefully restored to its original condition, the lens room cleaned and polished until it gleamed, and the keepers' quarters arranged to show how the lighthouse families had lived over the decades. Thomas had become something of a local celebrity, featured in the town newspaper and interviewed by a regional television station about the restoration project. But rather than making him self-conscious, the attention seemed to give him confidence. He spoke eloquently about the lighthouse's history, his plans for future exhibits, and the importance of preserving maritime heritage. "The lighthouse isn't just a building," he told the television reporter, standing confidently in the lens room with the vast ocean spread out behind him. "It's a story about people who dedicated their lives to keeping others safe. Every ship that made it safely to harbor, every family that didn't lose a father or a son to the sea, that's the real legacy we're trying to preserve here." David watched from behind the camera, his pride evident to anyone who looked. But Thomas barely noticed the filming equipment anymore. He was too absorbed in sharing something he genuinely cared about, something he'd helped bring back to life through months of dedicated work. The legal resolution came on a crisp autumn morning, just as Thomas was preparing for his first day at Millbrook Bay Elementary School. Mrs. Chen arrived with official documents and a smile that told the whole story before she spoke a word. "Congratulations," she said, handing the papers to David. "The guardianship has been approved. Thomas, you're officially home." The celebration that followed was characteristically low-key but deeply meaningful. David made Thomas's favorite pancakes for breakfast, and the three of them sat on the lighthouse observation deck sharing coffee and hot chocolate while watching fishing boats return with the morning catch. "So what happens now?" Thomas asked, still hardly believing it was real. "Now we keep doing what we're doing," David said simply. "You go to school, we finish the lighthouse project, and we see what adventures come next." "Will there be other projects?" David's smile was mysterious. Dr. Morrison mentioned something about a shipwreck museum they're planning down the coast. And there's talk of restoring the old Coast Guard station. Plenty of maritime history to preserve if you're interested. Thomas grinned, already imagining the possibilities. I'm definitely interested. School proved to be another positive transition. Thomas's work on the lighthouse had given him a reputation among his classmates, and his teachers were impressed by his knowledge of local history and his dedication to learning. For the first time, he felt like he belonged not just in David's house, but in the entire community. His favorite class was history, naturally, but he discovered an unexpected talent for creative writing when his English teacher assigned an essay about local landmarks. Thomas wrote about the lighthouse restoration with such passion and detail that she submitted it to a regional student writing contest. The first-place prize came with a small scholarship fund for future education and an invitation to present his essay at a maritime heritage conference. Standing at the podium in a room full of adults, Thomas spoke about the importance of preserving maritime history for future generations, about the stories hidden in old buildings and artifacts, about the way the past could inspire the future. Every lighthouse, every ship, every piece of maritime equipment has a story to tell, he concluded his presentation. But those stories will be lost forever if we don't take the time to listen, to preserve, to share them with others. The Millbrook Bay Light isn't just about the past. It's about ensuring that the lessons and legacy of those who came before us continue to guide ships safely home for generations to come. The standing ovation that followed made Thomas blush, but it also filled him with a deep sense of accomplishment. He was no longer just a boy who had been rescued from a desperate situation. He had become someone with knowledge to share, ideas worth hearing, contributions to make to the world. Winter brought a different kind of beauty to the lighthouse and the coastal town. Snow dusted the rocky shores, and ice formed delicate patterns on the lighthouse windows. The tourist season had ended, giving Thomas and David time to work on the more detailed aspects of their restoration project. They spent long evenings in the lighthouse's base, cataloging artifacts and preparing detailed descriptions for each exhibit. Thomas had become quite skilled at research, using the library's computer system to cross-reference ship names from old logbooks with historical records, creating comprehensive stories about the vessels that had relied on the lighthouse's guidance. One evening, while organizing a box of old photographs, Thomas found something that made him gasp. It was a picture of a young boy, probably about his own age, standing beside a lighthouse keeper in full uniform. The boy's face was serious but proud, and he wore clothes that suggested the photograph was taken sometime in the 1940s. "David, look at this," Thomas said, holding up the photograph. "This boy looks like he was about my age. Do you think he lived here?" David examined the picture carefully, then walked over to a display case where they'd arranged some personal items that had belonged to various lighthouse keepers. He pulled out a small, leather-bound journal and opened it to a page marked with a ribbon. "Listen to this," he said, reading from the journal. "October 15th, 1943. Young Billy Morrison has been a tremendous help with the light maintenance this month. His dedication to learning the proper procedures reminds me why this work is so important. Today he successfully lit the beacon entirely on his own, and his pride in the accomplishment was a joy to witness." Thomas looked back at the photograph with new understanding. Billy Morrison. Do you think he was related to Dr. Morrison? "Let's find out," David said, reaching for his phone. She did mention that her grandfather had been a lighthouse keeper somewhere along this coast. The phone call that followed was emotional for everyone involved. Dr. Morrison confirmed that Billy Morrison was indeed her grandfather, and that she had grown up listening to his stories about the Millbrook Bay Light. She had never seen the photograph Thomas had found, and when David offered to scan and send it to her, she was nearly moved to tears. "You know," she said during their conversation, "Billy always said that working at the lighthouse taught him more than any school ever could." He credited that experience with shaping his entire life's direction. He went on to become a maritime engineer and designed safety systems for ships all over the world. After the call ended, Thomas sat quietly for a long time, thinking about the boy in the photograph and the man he had become. There was something powerful about the connection across time, the idea that the same lighthouse that was shaping his own future had once inspired another young person to dedicate his life to maritime safety. "Do you think I'll make a difference like that?" Thomas asked David as they locked up the lighthouse for the evening. Thomas, David said, putting his arm around the boy's shoulders as they walked back toward the house. You're already making a difference. Every visitor who leaves here with a better understanding of maritime history, every young person who sees your passion and decides to learn more about preservation, every story you help preserve for future generations, that's all making a difference. But what if I want to do more? What if I want to help preserve lighthouses and maritime history all over the world? David stopped walking and turned to face Thomas, his expression serious but encouraging. Then that's exactly what you should do. You have the passion, the intelligence, and the dedication. With the right education and training, there's no limit to what you could accomplish. That night, as Thomas lay in bed listening to the familiar sound of waves against the shore, he began to envision a future that stretched far beyond Millbrook Bay. He imagined himself traveling to remote lighthouses, documenting their histories, helping to restore them for future generations. He pictured himself writing books about maritime heritage, lecturing at universities, inspiring other young people to care about preserving the past. The grief for his grandmother and parents would always be part of him, but it no longer defined his future. Instead, it had become fuel for his determination to make his life meaningful, to honor their memory by building something beautiful and lasting. As winter gradually gave way to spring, preparations began for the lighthouse's official opening as a museum. The event was scheduled for Memorial Day weekend, and the entire town was involved in planning the celebration. Thomas found himself at the center of much of the organizing, his opinion sought on everything from the order of exhibits to the wording of informational plaques. The week before the opening, a surprise visitor arrived at the lighthouse. Captain James Williams, nephew of the man who had mentored David years earlier, had driven down from Maine where he worked as a harbor pilot. He was a weathered man in his 60s, with hands that showed a lifetime of working with boats and rigging. "My uncle wrote about you before he died," he told David as they stood in the lighthouse's lens room. "Said you were one of the finest young men he'd ever had the privilege to mentor. He'd be proud to see what you've accomplished here." Then he turned to Thomas, studying the boy with the same careful attention his uncle had once given to David. "And you must be the young historian I've been hearing about. My uncle always said that lighthouses choose their keepers, not the other way around. Looks like this one chose well." Captain Williams spent 2 days with them, sharing stories about his uncle and other lighthouse keepers he'd known throughout his career. But more importantly, he spent time talking with Thomas about career possibilities in maritime fields, about the importance of young people entering professions related to the sea. "There's a summer program at the Maine Maritime Academy," he mentioned on his last evening with them, "for high school students interested in maritime careers. Covers everything from navigation to marine engineering to maritime history. You'd be a perfect candidate in a few years." Thomas filed that information away carefully, adding it to his growing collection of future possibilities. The world was beginning to feel much larger than it had during those desperate days on the train, full of opportunities he was only beginning to understand. The Lighthouse Museum's opening day exceeded everyone's expectations. Visitors came from hundreds of miles away, drawn by newspaper articles and word-of-mouth recommendations. Thomas found himself giving impromptu tours, answering questions, and sharing the stories he'd learned during months of restoration work. The highlight of the day was the ceremonial lighting of the lighthouse beacon at sunset. It wouldn't function as a navigational aid. Modern ships had no need for it. But the symbolic moment of illumination drew gasps of appreciation from the gathered crowd. Thomas stood beside David as the great lens began to rotate, sending its beam across the darkening waters. In that moment, surrounded by townspeople who had become like family, working beside the man who had saved his life in every way that mattered, he felt the profound satisfaction of work well done and purpose fulfilled. "Thank you," he said quietly to David as the crowd began to disperse. "For what?" "For seeing something in me when I couldn't see it in myself, for giving me a chance to become who I really am." David's smile was warm and proud. "Thank you for reminding me why this work matters, for showing me that the best way to honor the past is to invest in the future." As the last visitors departed and they secured the lighthouse for the night, Thomas realized that his journey was far from over. The train ride that had begun in desperation had led him to a life richer and more meaningful than he'd ever imagined possible. And tomorrow would bring new adventures, new opportunities to learn and grow and contribute to something larger than himself. The lighthouse beam continued to sweep across the water long into the night, a beacon of hope and guidance that would welcome countless visitors in the years to come. And in the house on the bluff, two souls who had found each other in their darkest moments slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they had not only survived their storms but had emerged stronger, ready to help others find their way safely home. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.